Before entering into a discussion of the events in the 20th century that brought freedom to the edge, I feel it's imperative to consider the 19th century phenomenon called populism. As I reviewed various movements and figures in the 20th century that impacted our freedoms with a view to focusing on some of the more significant, aspects of populism kept recurring so often that I felt it necessary to consider the movement and its aftermath in some depth at this point. The Populist Party is defined in the encyclopedia simply as the popular name for a political party which flourished in the 19th century toward the end of a long period of agricultural unrest in the United States. It was officially known as the People's Party, but the impact of the populist values cannot be confined to the short-lived history of the Populist Party, which was manifestly unsuccessful and fairly soon passed from the political scene. What then was the origin of populism? Will and Ariel Durant, in the excerpt from the Lessons of History, described how the Industrial Revolution gradually changed the economic form and the moral superstructures of European and American life. The old agricultural moral code had begun to die. In America, this phenomenon took an interesting form. Following the Civil War, the American farm community suffered increasingly severe economic hardships. Farm prices dropped, and no one, least of all the farm communities, can understand why. In hindsight, we now realize that perhaps some of the causes of this rural depression were the rapidly increasing production of farm products by the use of modern machinery and the vastly expanded transportation capabilities that brought American farmers into competition with producers of farm products throughout the world. But the American farmers did not recognize this, or perhaps they didn't want to recognize this. In any event, they looked for scapegoats, and they found them. American farmers began to blame their troubles on excessive charges by the railroads, but more importantly, on increasingly high interest rates. And they began to identify high interest rates and tight money with the gold standard, which we had adopted in 1873, and the demonetizing of silver as a basis for our currency, which had actually occurred as a result of the overproduction of silver. Now, eventually, however, this preoccupation with the gold standard grew to be identified with an amorphous international conspiracy by bankers to keep the money supply tight and inadequate. A number of European nations had already adopted the gold standard before we did, which purportedly lent support to these international conspiracy theories. The ramifications of this in 19th century Europe and its effect on the rise of National Socialism, which is really a fascinating element, are graphically demonstrated in Deborah Rothschild's fascinating exhibit called Prelude to a Nightmare, which is currently on view at the Williams College Museum of Art, and which I commend to those of you who have not yet seen it. In America, at the same time, rural populists came to regard their adversaries, who now included merchants and middlemen, as plutocrats, who controlled not only finance and industry, but the two major political parties as well. The populist leanings were precursors of later movements in the 30s, seeking the redistribution of wealth, but there were much darker elements lurking here. As a political movement, populism didn't get very far. Populist candidate for president in 1892 received only 22 electoral votes, and William Jennings Bryan, the Democratic nominee in 1896, a free silverist, who ran on a populist platform and was defeated 3 times in his run for the presidency. In a positive vein, the populists did call attention to the plight of the American farm community due to the growing power of private monopolies. They favored such measures as government ownership of the railroads. They advocated reasonable political reforms, such as the graduated income tax, anticipating many of the platforms of the progressive movement in the early 1900s. In fact, during the administrations of both Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, many of the populist demands were actually met through constructive legislation. But often, movements are best described by their antipathies, by what they're against rather than what they're for. Unfortunately, I feel this is the case with populism. These darker aspects of populism, its antipathies as it were, are articulately described by Richard Hofstadter in a book called The Age of Reform in these words: while its special association with agrarian reforms has now become attenuated, I believe populist thinking has survived in our own time, partly as an undercurrent of provincial resentments, popular and democratic rebelliousness, and suspiciousness and nativism. Now, eventually this xenophobia, this nativism, found a virulent expression in such movements as the Ku Klux Klan. As I will describe later in today's session, I find elements of it in such demagogic 20th century charismatics as Huey Long, Father Charles Coughlin, and can trace these influences as well in Martin Dyes and the House Un-American Activities Committee in the late 30s, and even a decade later during the McCarthy era. Hofstadter goes on to describe these xenophobic elements of the populist movement. The conspiratorial theory and the associated Anglophobic and Judophobic feelings were part of a larger complex of fear and suspicion of the stranger that haunted and still tragically haunts the nativist American mind, says Hofstadter. This feeling, though hardly confined to populists and Bryanites, was nonetheless exhibited by them in a particularly virulent form. Everyone remote and alien was distrusted and hated, even Americans, if they happened to be city people. The old agrarian conception of the city as the home of moral corruption reached a new pitch. Chicago was bad. New York, which housed the Wall Street bankers, was worse. London was farther away and even worse. This traditional distrust grew stronger as the cities grew larger and as they were filled with immigrant aliens. Nativist prejudices were equally aroused by immigration, for which urban manufacturers, with their insatiable demand for labor, were blamed. "We have become the world's melting pot," wrote Thomas Watson of Georgia. Watson was the populist candidate for vice president in 1892. "The scum of creation has been dumped on us. Some of our principal cities are more foreign than American. The most dangerous and corrupting orders of the old world have invaded us. The vice and crime which they've planted in our midst are sickening and terrifying. What brought these Goths and Vandals to our shores? The manufacturers are to blame. They wanted cheap labor and they didn't care a curse how much harm to our future might be the consequence of their heartless policy." Watson, by the way, eventually led a movement for the disenfranchisement of Negroes in Georgia and launched scurrilous attacks on Catholics and Jews that contributed to a revival of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, the 1930s, which spawned the infamous Dyes Committee, was a time of bewilderment and it was a time of irony. The American people were bewildered. They were shocked by the sudden and total collapse of an economic system that had seemed to work so well in the 20s. They were rendered numb by the suicides on Wall Street, and by sudden appearance on the streets of apple sellers who only months before had been productive, middle-class, or wealthy providers and heads of families, and who were now reduced to begging. And the collapse was not just temporary. Despite Herculean efforts by the new administration, by FDR, to jumpstart the economy, the economic collapse continued right up until our entry into the war with Germany and Japan in 1941. Now, this bewilderment surfaced not only in a questioning of economic values and systems. With the collapse of the markets, there came a questioning of the social and cultural values which were identified with a system of laissez-faire economics. The hyper-individualism of the 20s, the philosophies of Jeremy Bentham and Adam Smith. In the intellectual community, writers, playwrights, and filmmakers in particular began to turn toward what they viewed as social conscience as an antidote to hyper-individualism, to humanism and government involvement as an antidote to what they viewed as the distant, uninvolved governments of Harding and Coolidge. They turned to economic morality as an antidote to the morals of the marketplace, which they equated with the morality of profit and greed of the 20s, Babbitt, Main Street, the Great Gatsby. And another phenomenon began to make itself apparent. The great middle class, which during the 20s had looked upward to reach and identify with the rich, now began to find a commonality with the masses of the blue-collar and unemployed. Examples of this in films of the time and in the political and intellectual movements of the time are legion. And it was this phenomenon this moving away from the zeitgeist of the 20s, this perceived commonality with the downtrodden that laid the groundwork for severe attacks on the intellectual community, not only by the House Un-American Activities Committee and Martin Dies in the late 30s, and under J. Parnell Thomas and John Rankin later in the 40s, but as we shall see next week, by Joseph McCarthy in the late 40s and early 50s as well. Well, the 30s were not only a time of bewilderment, they were a time of great ironies. Whereas depression led the American intellectual and artistic community to a heightened social consciousness, the pour-over into politics often led to a confusion of the right and the left. In a seminal work on the era entitled The Great Depression, Robert McIlvaine entitles one of his chapters, Thunder on the Left. The irony I see in the 30s is that the so-called thunder on the left was often transformed into lightning on the right. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. perceived this. In The Age of Roosevelt, Schlesinger described the prescient comments of a political analyst of the 30s, Raymond Graham Swing. The fascist movement, Swing predicted, would be in its first stage radical and strongly nationalistic. And then it would combine with big business in a coalition. From that moment, democracy is doomed. In the first stage, radical. Echoes, of course, of National Socialism. I'll deal with 3 examples of this irony to which Swing alludes. There are, of course, many others. The first is the phenomenon of Huey Long of Louisiana, the kingfish. Although Long's political philosophy was so opportunistic, it cannot really be characterized as consistently right or left. It certainly gained a significant following from its call for a redistribution of wealth. And Long was well on his way to challenging the entrenched political party structure when he was assassinated in 1935. The second is the phenomenon of Father Charles Coughlin, the radio priest of the Little Flower of Jesus. His calls for wealth redistribution at one point attracted the largest radio audience in America, estimated in excess of 40 million, although his crusade eventually deteriorated into a proto-fascist morass and his eventual demotion by the Catholic Church. The final irony is the phenomenon of the Dies Committee itself, that began as a demand of the liberal left to investigate domestic fascism and finished as a lightning rod of the right and the forebear of McCarthyism. All bore some of the seeds of populism, but often with strange interminglings. All brought freedom close to the edge. Now, Huey Long came from Wynn Parish, Louisiana. The entire state of Louisiana during the first decades of the 20th century has been described as a breeding ground for radicalism. The state was controlled by an alliance of utilities, upstate planters, railroads, and Standard Oil of Louisiana. It's been estimated that when Huey Long was elected governor of the state in 1928, 1/5 of the white men could neither read nor write. Children were often virtual slaves working long hours in fields and factories. The road and school systems were in a state of woeful disrepair. Arthur Schlesinger once quipped, "Half a century of pent-up redneck rancor was awaiting release." In the 1800s, the parish of Wynn had been a stronghold of populism. In the 1920s, it was a stronghold of socialism. Wynn Parish gave over 1/3 of its votes to socialist candidate Eugene V. Debs over William Howard Taft in the election of 1912. Now, Long was one of 9 children of Huey Pierce Long, Sr., a typical Wynn Parish radical. Interviewed in 1935 at the height of his son's popularity, Long Sr. told a reporter, "There wants to be a revolution, I tell you. I've seen this domination of capital, seen it for over 70 years. What do these rich folks care for the poor man? They care nothing, not for his pain, not for his sickness, not for his death. Maybe you're surprised to hear me talk like that. Well, it was just such talk that my boy was raised under." Now, young Huey excelled at school, particularly in debating. Won a debating scholarship to Louisiana State, sold patent medicine to put himself through, and passed a 3-year law course in 8 months, becoming a lawyer at age 21. Huey Long was possessed of a razor-sharp mind. Elected to the post of railroad commissioner, later became the Public Service Commission, he assailed the oil companies, the railroads, and the telephone company, and soon established himself at age 25 as a champion of the people against the oligopolies that had controlled Louisiana since Reconstruction. After one failed attempt, he was elected governor of the state in 1928 on a banner, "Every man a king, but no one wears a crown." It was a takeoff on an old William Jennings Bryan slogan. His constituency was in part the old populist constituency. Raw-boned farmers had suffered much, and who weren't particularly polite about their politics. Today we'd probably call them rednecks. Long reveled in their adulation. "The state's full of sapsucker, hillbilly, and Cajun relations of mine," shouted Long, no doubt drawing on his skills as a patent medicine salesman. "And there ain't enough dignity in the bunch to keep a chigger still long enough to go brush his hair." And the rednecks cheered. And the rednecks laughed. And Long was elected governor at age 35. What followed was perhaps the closest thing to fascism in one state that this country has ever witnessed. On the plus side, Louisiana had never known such accomplishments. Like Mussolini, Long made the trains run on time. He also increased school appropriations, provided free textbooks, paved highways, built charity hospitals, built insane asylums. Long abolished the poll tax, enacted exemptions of property tax for the poor, exacted new levies from businesses, and enacted a debt moratorium for the poor. In a word, the impoverished folk of Louisiana had never had it so good, but at a price. When the legislature said no, Long would not listen. He cajoled, threatened, browbeat, bribed, whatever it took. He demolished the separation of powers. Long ignored senators and representatives and bulled his programs through. At one point, an opponent in the Senate shoved a book at Long and said, "Huey, maybe you heard of this book. It's the Constitution of Louisiana." "I'm the Constitution here now," reported Long. And he was. In 1934 and 1935, with Long in the Senate, but still very much in control of Louisiana, the legislature of Louisiana obediently transferred nearly every vestige of power and authority from the towns and parishes to the state, which meant Huey Long. By 1935, local government was literally at an end. In his Age of Roosevelt, Arthur Schlesinger described this incredible state of affairs. No municipal officer, policeman, or fireman, or school teacher could hold his job except by Long's favor. If elected officials defied the Long machine, the state could force their resignations by withholding public funds. Another law gave the governor, who was a Long lackey, power to make new appointments once the offices were vacated. If communities remained defiant, the governor could call out the militia and declare martial law, without accountability to anybody. To ensure against an uprising at the polls, the state government had exclusive authority to name all election commissioners. This enabled the machine to count the votes. And Kingfish's Supreme Court certified the constitutionality of his own program. Every man a king. But no one, only one, wore a crown. Of course, the separation of powers was obliterated. Louisiana was literally a totalitarian state within a democratic republic. Schlesinger tells us those who dared criticize the regime risked not only political and economic reprisals, but threats and beatings, kidnappings. Newspaper critics went armed day and night. Huey Long was not a nice guy. Long could not conceal his contempt for other human beings. He reveled in humiliating people. He was revenge-minded, flippant, brutal. And these were the qualities he carried with him as he turned his attention to Washington and was elected senator from Louisiana in 1932. In Washington, he spoke broadly of a redistribution of wealth, but when pressed for what he meant, Long had no program. There were no deeper meanings here. At the very outset, Long sided with Roosevelt and even helped him with his nomination in Chicago in 1932. But he and Roosevelt soon parted company when it became apparent that FDR regarded him as a dangerous rabble-rouser, one of the two most dangerous men in America, more dangerous even than Father Coughlin of Detroit. Long, meanwhile, reverting to the populist rhetoric of Wynn Parish, accused FDR of being dominated by the same old clique of bankers who had controlled Hoover. Now Long set his sights on control of nothing less than the entire United States. Louisiana wasn't enough. He settled on a platform insisting that the maldistribution of wealth was the cause of all social and economic distress. We're now in the midst of the Depression. Together with a spellbinding former fundamentalist preacher named Gerald L.K. Smith, Long formed a movement which he called the Share Our Wealth Society in January 1934. By July 1935, Long claimed 7 million members. Louis Howe, who was FDR's political guru, took notice. He feared Long, and what gave him nightmares was the possibility of a third-party formation involving Long, Father Coughlin, and Robert Townsend, all of whom espoused share the wealth schemes at about the same time. In 1935, Long was 42 years old and talking third-party formation, probably in 1936. Many people wondered whether Long was the first really serious American fascist. Long, of course, was a crass opportunist. He had no overriding social vision, no program except self-aggrandizement. As a result, his Share the Wealth program underwent multiple ramifications. In 1932, for example, he proposed that the government take by taxation all income over $1 million and all inheritances over $5 million. In 1934, he added a capital levy, which would reduce all fortunes to $3 million. Then he switched from the levies to the results, at first promising every American household a homestead allowance of $5,000 and an annual income of $2,000 and pensions of at least $30 a month for everyone over 60. It's all been described as a hillbilly's paradise. It was grossly unrealistic. There was no numeric basis, in fact, for any of it. Robert McIlvaine points out that a study in 1935 estimated that if all wealth in excess of $1 million were taken and given to those with assets of $5,000 or less, there would be only enough to grant each poor family $400. Moreover, to accomplish this fantasy of giving every family $5,000 estate would mean that no family in the country would be allowed to own more than $7,500. Long, however, had no interest whatsoever in such facts, nor in mundane issues such as economic recovery. But people were bewildered. The Depression had torn their lives and their fortunes to shreds, and they weren't interested in facts. They flocked to Long. His promises coincided with the aspirations of the common man, just as he had appealed to the commoners of Louisiana. In 1935, there were 27,000 Share Our Wealth clubs. Long received an average of 60,000 letters a week, and during one period of particularly vicious assaults on FDR, Long received 30,000 letters a day for 25 consecutive days. Long's plan in 1935 was not all that far-fetched. He would support an independent candidate for president in the 1936 election just to siphon off enough votes from FDR to elect a Republican. Things would be so bad under the Republicans that the country would turn to him in 1940, and he would be just 46. On the night of September 8, 1935, Carl Weiss, a young physician who detested Long as a tyrant, and whose family had suffered under the Long regime in Louisiana, shot and killed Huey Long. Long's national organization, built entirely on his own charisma and cunning and on populist and socialist fantasies, quickly evaporated. Huey Long's thunder on the left that was rapidly being transformed into menacing fascist lightning on the right was silenced, and freedom was brought back from the edge. Now, perhaps no phenomenon of the Depression years is more puzzling or more chilling than the meteoric rise and fall of Father Charles Coughlin. Yet on reflection, the bewilderment of the growing underclasses, the utter desperation of the lower middle class, the blue-collar working man, and eventually the professional classes, seeking answers to what seemed like unending economic oblivion, may give us more than a clue to the magnet of such articulate orators as Long and Coughlin, who offered panaceas. Today we look back objectively at such simplistic solutions as Long's Share Our Wealth Society, Coughlin's National Union for Social Justice. We wonder how such fantasies, with no grounds whatsoever in fact, could gain such national prominence. But we are not standing in the shoes of those once proud breadwinners, with heads bowed low, turned apple sellers. Well, how did Coughlin phenomenon begin? Charles Coughlin was born in Canada to a devout Catholic family. On her birthing bed, his mother reportedly prayed that if she had a daughter, she'd go to a convent. If she had a son, become a priest. Coughlin was literally raised in the church by his mother from the day of his birth and never considered another profession. He was a charismatic presence. He stood 5 feet 10 inches tall. He had the robust build of an athlete and had in fact excelled in athletics as a seminarian. He was a man with a strong, outgoing persona that exuded vigor and enthusiasm. But most important of all, he possessed a voice that was mellow, rich, manly, and one of confidential intimacy and ingratiating charm. Ellen Brinkley, in his book Voices of Protest, describes Coughlin's voice. It was a deep voice, capable of rising to higher pitches when appropriate. And Coughlin retained just a trace of an Irish brogue, which often exaggerated for effect, trilling his R's, changing his inflection to add warmth and color. It was one of the great speaking voices of the 20th century, a voice made for promises. Now, Coughlin's family moved to Detroit, and he was given his first parish in 1926 in Royal Oak, Michigan, a suburb of Detroit. He was charged with the task of establishing a new church there dedicated to the Catholic Church's newest saint, St. Teresa, also known as the Little Flower of Jesus. It was an inhospitable setting for a new church. The town of Royal Oak, although only 12 miles from downtown Detroit, had until recently been an isolated rural community. But Detroit was growing as an industrial center and booming during the heady days of the 20s. And the industrial population of Detroit was gradually pushing its way out toward the suburb of Royal Oak. The Catholic Church was a symbol of that industrial immigrant urbanization. Ku Klux Klan was a refuge for those older residents fearful of both Catholic and city incursions. And the new priest was confronted shortly after his arrival by a burning cross on the lawn of his new church. It was a large church for the area, seating 600 parishioners, and Coughlin had borrowed heavily from the archdiocese to construct it. Always entrepreneurial, Coughlin approached Leo Fitzpatrick, manager of the local radio station, WJR, and proposed that he be permitted to broadcast his sermons over the air to fight bigotry and to build up his church. Fitzpatrick agreed to try, and thus was launched one of the most meteoric and devastating careers of the 30s. Coughlin's first radio sermon was broadcast on October 7, 1926, from a specially installed microphone at the pulpit of his church in Royal Oak. He received 5 letters, and radio station WJR received a few more. Since the letters were favorable, Fitzpatrick and Coughlin decided to try broadcasting another sermon, then another. They soon realized they'd hit a home run. Coughlin's mail increased from those first 5 letters to dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. Soon they were coming in not only from Detroit, but from neighboring states within the range of WJR's strong signal. Many came with money, and it wasn't long before Coughlin's financial woes were more than amply taken care of. Within months of his first broadcast, Coughlin found it necessary to hire staff to open the mail, deposit the checks. He asked for and was given an assistant priest, and he soon established the Radio League of Little Flower, which was essentially a fundraising mailing list. By the year 1928, Coughlin was able to construct a church capable of seating 2,600 parishioners, with a granite tower 111 feet high, ostensibly dedicated to St. Teresa. It was in fact a monument to Coughlin. For 4 years during the 20s, Coughlin's sermons essentially non-controversial. He attacked the Klan, stuck to usual Catholic religious subjects, biblical parables, teachings of Jesus, birth control, and so forth. But in January 1930, his subject matter changed suddenly and dramatically, just as the stock market and the social order had crashed suddenly and dramatically. Coughlin's sermons reflecting the misery of the Detroit population, one of the most adversely affected by the Depression, began to attack so-called fallacious social and economic theories, which brought about the economic collapse. Among them, of course, were the selfish practices of so-called predatory capitalism. This was Coughlin's thunder on the left. Coughlin, like Long, had no pronounced, well-thought-out economic theories, just a sort of vague radicalism with increasingly populist overtones. But combined with the utter desperation of the times, the ubiquitous reach of radio, as virtually the only available mass medium, and the quality and tonality of his voice, Coughlin caught on as almost no other figure on the national scene except perhaps FDR. He attracted a larger audience now than Rudy Valley, Amos Anandi, Gracie Allen. He now employed 106 clerks, 4 personal secretaries to handle his mail that averaged 80,000 letters a week. At 3 p.m. on Sunday came the golden hour of the Little Flower. It's been estimated at the height of his popularity an audience of 40 million listened. In Boston, high school football games were suspended for an hour in the middle so that parents could listen to Coughlin. A poll was taken in St. Paul, Minnesota by a radio station which was considering the possibility of adding Coughlin and was canvassing potential listeners. It revealed that 137,000 wanted to listen, only 400 did not. Although Coughlin was now broadcasting over the CBS network, the officials at that station were becoming exceedingly nervous when his subject matter turned political. They dropped the program in April 1931. Coughlin was immune to this kind of problem, promptly arranged to be broadcast over his own network of 30 stations, which could be heard around the country. The underpinning of his sermons now increasingly became the redistribution of wealth through monetary manipulation. The attacks now began to sound more and more of populist ideology. Coughlin favored the remonetization of silver. He attacked the gold standard, began to sound a great deal like William Jennings Bryan. Long enough, Coughlin cried, have we been the pawns and chattels of the modern pagans who have crucified us upon a cross of gold. The filthy gold standard, which from time immemorial has been the breeder of hate, the fashioner of swords, and the destroyer of mankind. The international bankers he placed in a class of devils. Increasingly, of course, these attacks on bankers began to feature a number of Jewish banking families, such as the Rothschilds, the Warburgs, the Kuhn-Loebs, the Laszlo Frères, and presidential advisor Bernard Baruch. These were prominently sprinkled in among the Morgans and the Rockefellers. These modern Shylocks Coughlin harangued had caused the depression, were lusting greedily after profit. The artificial restriction of the flow of money was the cause of all misery. It was now unabashed populist rhetoric incarnate. At one point, he even lumped together capitalism and Marxism as Siamese twins. The attacks on the international banking community and communism in the same breath were pegged by Robert McIlvaine as not only a potential for fascism, but as the forerunner of such later right-wing extremist groups as the John Birch Society in the 1970s and 1980s. Well, why did Coughlin succeed so? It was not just his voice. Like Huey Long, he was attacking the evils of our economic and governmental systems in a simplistic way, offering a cast of villains who were easily identifiable and who could be held responsible for the horrible problems facing every day the majority of the populace. He struck at the banking community. Remember Mr. Potter, Lionel Barrymore in It's a Wonderful Life with James Stewart? Well, there weren't many defenders of that community out there among his radio audience. Many of his listeners had lost their money when the banks collapsed. Others had been denied loans to restart their failed businesses by banks. Others had suffered foreclosure of their mortgages and loss of their homes, farms, and property to banks. The vaunted populist condemnation of the banking community for encouraging tight money was still fresh in the minds of many of his listeners. In 1932, Coughlin began to insist that increased productivity without a proper distribution of profits was the root cause of the Depression. The people didn't have the money to spend, so the system dried up. The concentration of wealth was the most serious problem. Again, thunder on the left. At one point, Coughlin explained, capitalism is doomed and not worth trying to save. More thunder on the left. So what to do? Coughlin's antidote to this misery was to form the National Union for Social Justice. To be a member of the organization meant merely to listen to Coughlin, to contribute and espouse the principles of social justice, whatever those meant. Since they seemed to change from week to week, Arthur Schlesinger Jr. points out there were few issues in these years which Father Coughlin did not take both sides more resoundingly than anyone else. At first, Coughlin, like Huey Long, had sided with FDR. Early in FDR's administration, Coughlin had ranked him in the Hall of Fame, alongside of Washington and Lincoln. At one point, he even characterized the New Deal as Christ's deal. But in time, Coughlin fell out with FDR. Finally, he broke with FDR in November 1935, attacking the New Deal as unalterably opposed to the principles of social justice. And now, from the thunder on the left, came the lightning on the right. The communist-infiltrated New Deal, he said, was the government of the bankers, by the bankers, and for the bankers. But breaking with FDR proved Coughlin's undoing. Coughlin lost a great portion of his following after his attacks on FDR. His response, however, was to step up his attacks on the administration, which now became more shrill and began to edge even closer to fascism. His followers more and more now fit the proto-fascist profile. Often they were of the lower middle class, fundamentalist, anti-Semitic, like the Gerald L.K. Smith leadership of the Long Movement. Meetings and rallies were characterized by shrieks, moans, rolling of the eyes, brandishing of the arms. The following had now become a fanatic emotional personality cult, and Coughlin's popularity fell dramatically in the late 1930s. In 1936, he joined forces with Gerald L.K. Smith, following Long's assassination, to form a political party known as the Union Party, which adopted a platform not dissimilar from that of his National Union for Social Justice. Its candidate was a man by the name of William Lemke of North Dakota, who was an agrarian populist type of figure, supporting the farmers of the Great Plains. This man was resoundingly defeated, and Coughlin was disgraced as a political force. The abysmal showing of Lemke apparently stunned Coughlin. He apologized for the campaign and announced he was quitting the air in 1938. In 1938, Coughlin's true colors came to the fore as he declared support for the corporate state of Benito Mussolini, and by 1940 he was praising Adolf Hitler. After Pearl Harbor, his attacks continued in his publication Social Justice. He became even more shrill and venomous. When he wrote of the superiority of the Axis powers and the dangers of associating with sleazy Britishers, the Postmaster General barred the publication from the mails, and the Attorney General threatened to charge him with sedition. Now he was rebuked by the Church and quietly retired to his parish in Royal Oaks and remained there silently for 24 years. He retired in 1966 and lived quietly until his death in 1979 at the age of 88. The lightning on the right, the American proto-fascists, Long and Coughlin, bore many chilling resemblances to the fascism of Hitler and Mussolini. Appeals to the ideas of deep-rooted community, to predominantly rural folk values, the simple virtues of the common man, the simple rural values you read about in Will and Ariel Durant's piece. These appealing values were contrasted starkly and dramatically with the dangers of vast hidden forces. Forces involving the conspiratorial combination of heavy industrialization, the international banking community, financial parasites, usurious moneylenders. We could easily spend an entire session just analyzing such comparisons. They are fascinating. The parallels to National Socialism here run very, very deep. But the understanding of populism, Long, Coughlin, and the fascist fringe is only one aspect of understanding the background that led to McCarthyism and the sedition mindset, which was certainly one of the greatest threats ever to our freedoms. I would like to turn finally to another element of that background, namely the cultural and intellectual atmosphere of the 30s that helped give birth to the House Special Committee on Un-American Activities. We have seen in the person of the demagogues Long and Coughlin how ironically populist-inspired thunder on the left was transformed into lightning on the right. But an even more ominous development was the dangerous and vicious lightning on the right, which was generated in response to the growing intellectual, artistic, and political thunder on the left of the 30s. We've alluded before to the ideological conflict in the 30s between what has been characterized as competing American value systems. Acquisitive individualism on the one hand, and what was perceived particularly by the intellectual community, as cooperative or ethical individualism on the other. Now, those are big words, and you might say, what did the average American know or care about such subtle differences? Well, the answer is he didn't. At least he didn't rationally realize the difference from the intellectual and moral atmosphere of the 20s. But he sure felt it. Let me give you a concrete example of what I mean. The artistic expression of the yearning for fairness, morality, and humanitarianism, evidenced in John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, is reflective of the popular sentiments of the times. Give it any label you wish, the sentiments were there. The Grapes of Wrath, as you all know, is a heartrending tale of the misery suffered by the sharecroppers known as Okies, living in the Oklahoma Dust Bowl. John Steinbeck tells the story of Tom Joad, played by Henry Fonda in the movie, just released from prison, who comes back to Oklahoma, to his home, to find his sharecropper parents being dispossessed by the Shawnee Land Company. Roaring bulldozers are coming to demolish their homes and force them into a seemingly endless stream of fellow Okies on an agonizing trip west to find work. "Who's the Shawnee Land Company?" asked Joe. "It ain't nobody," comes the reply. The Joads are being uprooted and shattered by a shadow, an unseen, anonymous corporate presence. It's only when the poor, disillusioned Joads travel west and encounter the same hostility and inhumanity as in Oklahoma, and suffer the humiliation of living in virtual captivity in work camps, they organize against what they feel was the meanest spirit of capitalism. Steinbeck's hero, Tom Joad, a man who had killed and would kill again, is inspired by Casey, a former preacher, played by John Carradine, to philosophize about morality, the maldistribution of wealth, capitalist system. I've been thinking a hell of a lot about our people living like pigs in the land laying fallow. Or maybe one fellow with 1,000,000 acres while 100,000 good farmers is starving. And I've been wondering if all our folks got together and yelled. As he's forced to flee from the family at the movie's end, Tom tells Ma, "Well, maybe I can scrounge around and find out what's wrong." And then this, "Well, maybe like Casey says, a fella ain't got a soul of his own, but only a piece of a big one, and then it don't matter. Then I'll be around in the dark. I'll be everywhere, wherever you look. Wherever there's a fight so hungry people can eat, I'll be there. Whenever there's a cop beating up a guy, I'll be there." Steinbeck's novel and the film by John Ford swept the country in the 30s and 40s. What was happening in this immensely popular work of the time? The evils of what was styled as the self-absorbed capitalist greed were being exposed in what was perceived as all of their rawest forms. New moral economic values were being brought home, the values of compassion, values of sharing. They were brought home perhaps most forcefully in a scene at a truck stop. The Joad children had come in with Grandpa to buy just a half a loaf of old bread, and they're eyeing candy displayed in a window and a counter, but they have only 1 penny. They're proud people, the Joads. They pay for what they get. "How much is that candy?" asked Gramps. "2 for a penny," responds the proprietor to a startled waitress. After the kids leave, thrilled with the candy, 2 truck drivers sitting at the counter volunteer. "Hey, mister, them's not 2 for a penny candy, there's nickel apiece candy." "What's it to you?" replies the proprietor. Truck drivers leave the money on their counter. As they head out the door, the waitress calls out, "Hey, you got change coming." Truck drivers, without missing a beat, say, "What's it to you?" They head out the door. Sentimental? Yeah. Melodramatic? You bet. Very much reflective of the spirit of the times. Although this work evidences disgust with the philosophy of greed, it does not advocate collectivism. It's really calling for a kind of cooperative individualism, saying in effect that individuals can achieve a sense of independence and self-respect only by by cooperating with one another. Call it a philosophy of sticking together, of participation, of belonging. What is clear is in the 1930s, these values were appealing to an ever-increasing portion of the middle class, who were now, for perhaps the first and maybe the only time in our history, feeling a shared interest with blue-collar laborers. Does this mean that the mass of working and middle-class Americans were becoming socialists? Not really. But they were certainly edging to the left. McIlvaine realizes that many of these sentiments, which were reflective of middle-class thinking during the Depression, sentiments such as we've just seen Steinbrück portray, fairness, equality, humanitarianism, compassion, moral economics, did not necessarily constitute a coherent ideology. I don't know how many of you have ever mixed a martini, but ideology among those who are not professional intellectuals is like vermouth, says McIlvaine. A hint is essential, but too much will spoil the result. Consider, if you will, that FDR was not beyond using class-oriented rhetoric and symbols in selling the New Deal, which was characterized as social liberalism. And FDR was resoundingly successful politically. McIlvaine points out that there were significant differences between the social liberalism of FDR and the liberal socialism of the left. But the common man could be forgiven for not being able to tell the difference and taking what he could get. But in the Cold War McCarthy period, in the sedition mindset, which we're going to explore next week, this decade of the 30s came to be known as the Red Decade. Intellectuals, screenwriters, film directors were persecuted for the beliefs they shared in the 30s. HUAC and McCarthy's Senate subcommittee, which wreaked havoc with our freedoms in the next decades, were not concerned with populistic distinctions between FDR's social liberalism and the intellectuals' liberal socialism. And many of their victims came from just this intellectual milieu of the 30s. But what then drove many of these intellectuals and artists in the Depression? What created this cannon fodder for HUAC and McCarthy? The number of prominent intellectuals and artists in their search for a life of community, of sharing, had unfortunately flirted with the philosophy of Karl Marx. Some were members of the Communist Party during the 30s. In September 1932, for example, 52 writers, critics, and professors signed an open letter in support of the communist presidential candidate, William Z. Foster. Among them were Hurston Caldwell, Sherwin Anderson, John Dos Passos, Theodore Dreiser, numerous others. The Marxist dialectic, the mechanist image of man, that is substructure. That is the concept of man like a machine, merely reacting to the forces of nature, to the means of production, are all alleged by Marx to be part of an inevitable historical process. It was an appealing thought. The Depression left many ordinary people, as well as intellectuals and artists, feeling that powerful forces beyond their control were driving them in their desperate search for answers to this dilemma. The Marxist concept of determinism, the inevitability of it all, became believable to many. Many in the intellectual community lost sight of the philosophical substructure that made this country unique. They lost the emphasis, if you will, of a George Mason, a Thomas Jefferson. They no longer envisioned man primarily as a self-determining being. The emphasis was no longer on man's innate capacity for reflecting and choosing. A number thus blundered into the Communist Party. Many joined communist front organizations with warm, fuzzy, harmless-sounding names. For many intellectuals and artists, it was a short-lived infatuation. Others tried to blend parts of Marxism with American ideals, take communism away from the communists, Americanize communism. Liberal journalism abounded with articles by American intelligentsia attempting to blend what they called equal justice and a redistribution of wealth, benefiting those who had been disinherited by the system, with freedom and individualism in the American tradition. It was an exercise in futility. We were in pain. The system had failed. The American dream was shattered. Our values were in turmoil. It was a period of shock and bewilderment. We were groping for answers. Now, into this chaotic mix came the Dies Committee. was not initially called the Dies Committee. Perhaps the great irony was that the committee came about as a result of the intense lobbying of one Samuel Dickstein, a liberal congressman from the city of New York. Walter Goodman has compared Dickstein in his book, The Committee, to the Greek figure Pyrrhus. Pyrrhus, you'll recall, was that pathetic Greek king whose military victories in the 4th century BC were attained at such cost that they were in reality defeats, giving rise to the phrase Pyrrhic victory. Sam Dickstein represented a district which ran along the East River in Manhattan's Lower East Side, from Chatham Square to East Houston Street. It was a district filled with immigrants who, like Dickstein's parents, had fled the pogroms of Europe to find freedom from anti-Semitism and a new life in the Golden Kingdom, so-called Golden Medina of the New World. Unfortunately, as Hitler was marching in Europe, Nazi sympathizers were rallying openly in the United States. Fascist leaders, both here and in Europe, like Fritz Kuhn and Adolf Hitler, for that matter, were all appealing to many of the same members of the troubled middle class who were terrified that they were unable to control their own destinies. The European anti-Semitic tradition, which drew much of its strength from the legendary association of Jews in the 1890s with control of the banking community, and which eventually found kindred spirits among a number of the populists and their successors, had gained a firm foothold in the United States. The German-American Bund was gaining strength. In Detroit, thousands were reported parading around in youth movement uniforms shouting Heil Hitler. And 25,000 reportedly attended a Bund rally in Nassau County. At a meeting in Yorkville and Manhattan to celebrate Hitler's takeover in Austria in 1938, stormtroopers armed with blackjacks had converged on dissenters in the audience before the police finally broke it up. Sam Dickstein was desperate to fight back. But when he looked closely at the Constitution, he found it difficult in view of the Bill of Rights to prevent individuals from joining together in Teutonic friendship to drink a few beers, praise Hitler, criticize the Jews. There was nothing to legislate against, as detestable as it all might seem. But Sam thought he saw a way to lash out against the fascists through the investigative arm of Congress, not the legislative arm. Nothing in the Constitution prevented investigating them. You'll remember that in our first session, we discussed the blur and the strict check on the legislative branch as originally envisioned by the framers, resulting from the adoption by the legislative branches of rules and regulations under Article 1, Section 5 of the Constitution, which embellish their basic constitutional powers. As a result, the precedents were surely there, and Sam saw them. Congressional liberals had held congressional investigations in the 20s into the Teapot Dome scandal, banks, lobbies, railroads, the munitions industry, strikebreakers, and the stock exchange. There was no constitutional or other requirement that investigative committees formulate a statute as the end game of their work. Presumably, the edification of the public was sufficient justification for their efforts. And therein, ironically, lies the genesis of one of the most infamous committees in the history of our legislature, the House Special Committee on Un-American Activities, or HUAC. Now, Sam Dickstein was loud and brash. Sam had an irascible temper. He was not popular in the House. When Dickstein introduced a resolution calling for a committee to probe all organizations within the United States, quote, diffusing un-American propaganda of religious, racial, or subversive political prejudices, his resolution was defeated by a resounding 184 to 38. Dickstein now accurately determined that he himself was the main stumbling block to his resolution. So 3 months later, when Martin Dies, a young Texas conservative and unknown to Dickstein, a supporter of the Klan, put forward a new version of the Dickstein resolution, the small, unpopular representative from New York's Lower East Side and the big, rowdy, popular Texas conservative joined forces in the cause of a committee to, quote, investigate subversive and un-American propaganda, end quote. Dickstein, of course, was thinking about Nazis and fascism. Dies was not. Dickstein even pressed for it to become a standing committee of the House. Perhaps the ultimate irony is that Dickstein would live to see his dream fulfilled by one of the most notorious anti-Semites ever to grace the halls of Congress, John Rankin of Mississippi. Well, Martin Dies had come from the Hill people of East Texas. The Hill people were largely of Anglo-Saxon stock. They shared typical populist sentiments. They distrusted big cities, bankers, big capital, big labor, big government. They were xenophobes, suspicious of anything and anybody foreign. Unemployment, they felt, was caused by the influx of cheap foreign labor. Dye's first bill, in fact, which failed of passage, would have suspended all immigration to the United States for 5 years. But when Dies appeared before the House to call up his Un-American Activities Committee enabling resolution in May 1938, he was the very model of a model anti-fascist. He had cleaned up his act and even combed his hair, and he evinced great concern about the Nazi menace in the United States, and Bundes saluting the swastika. He was worried, he asserted, that President Roosevelt might be assassinated by one of the 480,000 Nazis in the United States. Strange bedfellows, Dickstein and Dies, but that's the combination that assembled a winning vote from both sides of the political spectrum. The Dies resolution passed by 191 to 41. After it passed, Sam Dickstein was elated. He requested permission to speak for 3 minutes. He was turned down. 2 days later, the House announced the members of the new committee. Sam Dickstein was not one of them. Although Dickstein was not named and never served in the House Special Committee on Un-American Activities, or HUAC as it came to be known, another cast of characters of a very different political persuasion, namely Martin Dies, J. Parnell Thomas, and John Rankin, made it their home for the next decade. Needless to say, from its inception, Martin Dies' committee was not interested in the fascists it was created to investigate. It was interested only in the actions of alleged communists and New Dealers and the fuzzy so-called Communist Front groups. Fascist groups such as the Silver Shirts, the Ku Klux Klan, the Knights of the White Camellia, lauded the work of the committee, even when, as window dressing, they were called to testify before it. The focus of the committee under Dies was on activities such as publishing the names found on the mailing list of such hapless groups as the American League for Peace and Democracy, or investigating harmless left-wing leading organizations such as the American Youth Congress, which numbered Eleanor Roosevelt among its defenders. J. Parnell Thomas, an overweight bellicose bond and insurance salesman from Allendale, New Jersey, rose to become chairman of HUAC from 1945 to 48. During that time, he launched, as we know, an attack on the film industry, which resulted in the conviction of a group of Hollywood screenwriters, actors, and directors known as the Hollywood 10. Many of them, during the intellectual turmoil of the 30s we've just considered, had joined the Communist Party or affiliated knowingly or unknowingly with Communist Front organizations. Apparently, some still were affiliated. After a conservative-leaning Supreme Court upheld the convictions, an emboldened HUAC paraded informers before it with regularity and much fanfare. It was the height of the McCarthy era, and the sedition mindset was now anchored. The blacklist became institutionalized. The backlash against the thunder on the liberal left in the 30s, which helped give birth to HUAC, had now come home to roost. The quality and the subject matter of films was seriously affected for a long time. The careers of hundreds in the industry were shattered. An era of thought control, mind control like no other we've ever seen was ushered in. Dye's choice of targets and his methods established in the 30s set a pattern for the Thomases and the Rankins who assumed control during the heyday of HUAC in the 40s and 50s. And these tactics were eventually parroted in good measure by McCarthy in the Senate as well. The Hiss case was, of course, the most famous case to come before HUAC. Perhaps the ultimate irony to its creator, Sam Dickstein, it was his creation, HUAC, that launched the meteoric career of Richard Milhous Nixon. So we've come a long way today. What have we seen? The Industrial Revolution had clearly wrought tectonic shifts upon the moral and economic landscape of 19th century Europe and America. The populist movement in this country was born out of the economic and moral bewilderment and paranoia of the agrarian community as both its livelihood and its moral code and its value systems eroded during the latter half of the 19th century. We have witnessed how populist-inspired thunder on the left was transformed in the 30s into lightning on the right in the presence of charismatic demagogues such as Long and Coughlin, and they were dangerous enough in their own right. But the thunder on the liberal left in the 30s, the cultural and intellectual movements which rose out of the desperation of the people in their economic plight and bewilderment, had given populism's heirs apparent the opportunity to create a monster in the form of Huey. And that monster and the mindset it bred came close to eradicating our freedoms in the decades that followed. Well, how then did our political system deal with these phenomena in the 40s and 50s? Next week, the Truman administration copes with the attacks of McCarthy, MacArthur, and McCarran. Thank you.